What do you do when your billionaire husband is sipping champagne in paradise with his mistress, while you're screaming through labor alone? Grace Holloway didn't just survive that betrayal. She destroyed him. Blake Sutherland thought he was untouchable, a CEO, a master manipulator. He was wrong. This is the story of a woman who lost everything and built an empire from the ashes, and a man who had paradise but threw it all away. If you want to see how Grace turned her worst day into her greatest victory, stay until the end. Hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe. Let's begin. The silence in the Tribeca penthouse was the kind money bought. Triple-paned windows filtered out the chaos of Manhattan 23 floors below, leaving only the sterile hum of central air and the distant rumble of Grace Holloway's own heartbeat. At 9 months and 6 days pregnant, she felt less like a woman and more like a vessel, taut and aching, waiting for permission to break. She sat on the custom Italian sofa, one hand resting on the impossible curve of her belly, where her son was staging what felt like a gymnastic rebellion. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Hudson River stretched out like hammered steel under the October sky. It was a view that cost $7 million. It was supposed to mean she had everything. Blake Sutherland, her husband of 5 years, moved through this farm room with the focused efficiency of a man who built empires. At 44, he was Manhattan venture capital royalty, the celebrated founder of Meridian Capital. He had a jaw that belonged on currency, eyes like storm clouds over the Atlantic, and the kind of charisma that made investors write checks before they understood what they were funding. "Just London, babe," his voice carried from the bedroom. He emerged fastening a Patek Philippe around his wrist, wearing a Tom Ford suit that cost more than her first car. "Emergency investor meeting for the Helix Bio acquisition. I'll be back before you can miss me." Grace pressed her palm against her belly as another Braxton Hicks contraction tightened like a fist. "Dr. Morrison said it could be any day. Blake, he specifically said you shouldn't be traveling this close to my due date." Blake crossed the living room and knelt before her, his cologne filling the space between them, expensive and familiar. He took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles in a gesture he had perfected over 5 years of marriage. "And I'll be on the first flight back the second you feel a real contraction. The jet's on standby. You have my word." His eyes held hers with practiced sincerity. He was good, so devastatingly good. She wanted to believe him. For 5 years, she had built her life around believing him. She had been the perfect wife, graceful at his fundraising galas, silent during his late-night conference calls, understanding about the lipstick on his collar that one time, which he had explained away as an overly enthusiastic congratulations from a female board member. She had given up her position as director of a domestic violence nonprofit when they married because Blake said his world required a full-time partner. She had agreed because she loved him, because she thought love meant sacrifice. Now, pregnant and completely financially dependent, she felt the weight of every choice that had led her here. "London, right?" she asked, keeping her tone light. "Who's the meeting with again?" A flicker, so slight she would have missed it a year ago, before pregnancy had sharpened every instinct she possessed. His eyes held hers a fraction too long. "The Helix Bio Board, standard due diligence. You know how it is." He leaned in and kissed her, a brief brush of lips that felt more like punctuation than passion. "Paige is coming over this afternoon. You won't be alone. I'll call as soon as I land." He stood, grabbing his leather bag. "I love you." "I love you too," she whispered to his retreating back. The lie tasted like metal in her mouth. The heavy door clicked shut and the silence rushed back in, thick and suffocating. Grace remained motionless, listening to the elevator descend, carrying her husband away. London, Helix Bio Board. It sounded so plausible. Blake was a master of plausible deniability. She pulled her laptop from the side table, her fingers trembling slightly. She wasn't paranoid. She was just checking, verifying. Her sister Paige, the divorce attorney with the cynical worldview, had taught her a trick months ago, almost as a joke. Private jet tail numbers were public record if you knew where to look. Grace typed in Meridian Capital's jet registration. The flight plan populated on her screen, filed 90 minutes ago. Destination Providenciales, Turks and Caicos. Not London, not even close. The air left her lungs in a painful rush. Turks and Caicos. The phrase conjured images of crystal water and white sand, of honeymooners and secret lovers. It was the opposite of a boardroom in London. Her mind raced, trying to construct an explanation. A layover. An impossible detour. But the lie had been so specific. The Helix Bio Board. London. She fumbled for her phone, her hands slick with cold sweat. She pulled up Instagram, typed in a name she had been trying to ignore for months. Amber Fitzgerald. Blake's 27-year-old chief of staff. The woman with sharp ambition and expensive taste that exceeded her salary. The woman Blake always defended as, essential to operations. Amber's profile was public, curated for maximum impact. Rooftop bars in Soho, gallery openings in Chelsea, business class lounges around the world. And then posted 30 minutes ago, a video. The clip was short, an infinity pool overlooking turquoise water, lush tropical greenery in the background. The camera panned to two champagne flutes on the pool's edge. Then, briefly, catastrophically, the angle dipped to show two pairs of feet in the water. One pair with perfectly manicured red toenails, the other, larger, distinctly male. Grace knew those feet. She had massaged them countless times after Blake's long days. She knew the slight crook in his left big toe from a college soccer injury. The caption was a single word, paradise. The contraction that hit her then was different from anything before. It was a deep, primal seizing that stole her breath and turned her vision white. She gasped, her phone clattering to the floor. Another contraction followed. Stronger. Real. Her water hadn't broken. But she knew that her son was coming, and his father was in paradise with another woman. Grace's first instinct was to call Blake, to demand he turn the plane around, that their son was arriving and he needed to be here. Her thumb hovered over his name in her contacts. But she stopped. If she called him now, what would she hear? More lies. He would pretend to be in a London conference room while Caribbean waves crashed in the background. He would gaslight her through labor, making her doubt her own senses while she brought their child into the world. The betrayal was a cold shard of ice sliding between her ribs. It hurt worse than the contractions. Her phone buzzed. Paige. Thank God. Hey, just parked. I'm coming up. Did the Prince of Lies get off to his fake business trip? Okay. Grace tried to respond, but another contraction tore through her. She couldn't suppress the low moan that escaped. Ellie, Paige's voice sharpened with alarm. She had called Grace Ellie since childhood, a nickname only family used. Was that, "Are you okay? Is it time?" I think so, Grace gasped. And Paige? He lied. He's not in London. He's in Turks and Caicos. Silence on the other end. Then her sister's voice came through, stripped of all warmth, cold and hard as steel. I'm in the elevator. Don't move. We're getting you to the hospital right now. And Grace, we're going to bury him. Paige burst through the door 3 minutes later, her face pale with fury on her sister's behalf. She had never trusted Blake, had seen him not as a charismatic titan, but as a narcissist wearing an expensive suit. Grace had always defended him, accused her sister of being too cynical. Now she understood. Paige had been right all along. Can you walk? Paige asked, already grabbing the hospital bag Grace had packed weeks ago. Yes. No. I don't know. Another contraction doubled her over. Paige's arms were around her, strong and sure. We've got this. Breathe with me. In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it. But they made it to the car. Paige drove like she was fleeing a crime scene, which in a way, they were. The crime of a man choosing pleasure over his family. In the passenger seat, Grace pulled out her phone with shaking hands. She sent Blake a text, keeping it simple. In labor, going to Mount Sinai. Where are you? She watched the message show as delivered. Then read. The typing indicator appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, just landed in London. Brutal overnight flight. Meeting starting soon. This is incredible news. How far apart are the contractions? Call me if it gets serious. Love you. Grace stared at the message. The casual tone. The complete fabrication. The instruction to call if it gets serious, as if labor was some minor inconvenience that might not warrant his attention. What did he say? Paige asked. Running a red light. He's doubling down. Says he's in London. Grace's voice was hollow. He has no idea I know. Good, Paige said grimly. Let him think he's gotten away with it. Let him enjoy his last few hours of peace. At Mount Sinai Hospital, the sterile white walls and beeping monitors became Grace's entire universe. The contractions came faster now, relentless waves that crested and broke, leaving her gasping in their wake. Through it all, one thought played on repeat. He chose this. He chose paradise over me, over his son. A nurse checked her dilation. 6 centimeters, moving fast for a first baby. Paige stood guard by the bedside, phone in hand, her face a mask of controlled rage. I'm calling Victor Brennan, she said. Not a question. Victor Brennan was a legend in Manhattan divorce circles. They called him the cremator because he didn't just win cases. He reduced opposing counsel to ash. He was brilliant, ruthless, and expensive enough that his retainer alone could fund a small country. Paige, I can't think about that right now, Grace said through gritted teeth. You don't have to think. I'll handle everything. Just focus on Connor. Connor. They had agreed on the name months ago. It meant lover of hounds in Irish. But Grace had chosen it because it also meant strong-willed. Her son would need to be strong-willed. He was entering a broken world. 8 centimeters. The pain was transcendent now, beyond description. Grace existed only in the space between contractions, brief moments of relief before the next wave hit. Her phone buzzed. Blake. How's it going? Stuck in all-day meetings, but thinking of you. Keep me posted. The casual dismissal, the complete absence of urgency. He thought she was still at home, timing contractions, hours away from actual delivery. Don't respond, Paige said, seeing Grace reach for the phone. Let him wonder. Let him sweat. But Blake wasn't sweating. While Grace screamed through transition, while nurses coached her breathing, while her body was torn apart bringing life into the world, Blake Sutherland was 700 miles away, floating in an infinity pool with his chief of staff, completely ignorant that his perfectly constructed lies were about to detonate. 10 centimeters? Time to push. You can do this, Paige whispered, gripping her hand. You are the strongest person I know. Grace pushed and pushed and pushed. For 93 minutes, she fought to bring her son into the world. No husband, no partner, just her sister's fierce love and her own determination not to break. At 3:47 p.m. on October 15th, Connor Blake Holloway entered the world with a lusty cry that cut through every machine beep and medical instruction. They laid him on Grace's chest, 8 pounds of squirming perfection. And in that moment, the world contracted to just the two of them. He was here. He was real. He was hers. She named him Connor after strength, after determination, and she gave him her last name, Holloway, not Sutherland, a small act of rebellion, the first of many. He's perfect, Paige whispered, tears streaming down her face. Grace, he's absolutely perfect. Grace looked at her son, at his tiny fingers curled into fists, at his eyes that would eventually turn the same warm brown as hers. We're going to be okay, she whispered to him. I promise you, we're going to be more than okay. In Turks and Caicos, Blake Sutherland checked his phone between kisses with Amber Fitzgerald. Still no urgent messages from Grace. Good. He had time. He had always been lucky like that. His phone showed one unread text from an unknown number. Mr. Sutherland, this is Victor Brennan. I represent your wife in the matter of her impending divorce. My office will be in contact shortly. Blake stared at the message, read it 3 times. Then looked at Amber, lounging in the infinity pool, completely unaware that she had just destroyed both their lives with a single Instagram post. Something wrong, she asked. I think, Blake said slowly, his world tilting on its axis. We need to get back to New York. Right now. Blake's private jet touched down at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey at 9:30 p.m. He had spent the entire flight in damage control mode, deleting text messages, rehearsing his story, coaching Amber to scrub her social media. He had convinced himself he could fix this. He always fixed things. The plan was simple: fly directly to Mount Sinai, arrive full of apologies about the London meeting running long, hold his son, charm Grace back into submission. She always forgave him. 5 years of marriage had taught him that Grace's capacity for forgiveness was bottomless. As the jet taxied to the private terminal, Blake adjusted his tie and ran a hand through his hair. He had even stopped in the Turks and Caicos airport to buy an overpriced I Love London snow globe as a prop. The attention to detail was what separated him from amateurs. The jet door opened. Cool October air rushed in, carrying the smell of jet fuel and distant rain. Blake descended the stairs, leather bag in hand, snow globe tucked under his arm. His driver should be waiting. But the black sedan on the tarmac wasn't driven by Marcus, his usual driver. Instead, a woman stepped out, mid-50s, silver hair pulled into a severe bob, wearing a gray pantsuit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her expression was completely neutral, which somehow made her more terrifying. Behind her, two large men in dark suits emerged from the vehicle. They looked like they ate corporate executives for breakfast. Blake Sutherland, the woman's voice was quiet but cut through the night like a scalpel. "Yes," Blake said, confused. He looked past her, expecting Marcus to appear. "Who are you?" "My name is Victor Brennan," she said. Her eyes locked onto his with the focus of a predator who had just spotted dinner. "I represent your wife, or rather your soon-to-be ex-wife." The words hit Blake like a physical blow. Victor Brennan, the text message. This was real. "I don't understand," he stammered, his practiced composure crumbling. "There's been some mistake. I was in London on business. I can prove it." He gestured vaguely with the hand holding the snow globe. Victor Brennan allowed herself a small, cold smile. It didn't reach her eyes. "Ah, yes. London. And I suppose that snow globe is from Big Ben." She took a step closer, her voice dropping. "Let me save you the embarrassment of further perjury. Mr. Sutherland, we have your jet's flight logs to Turks and Caicos. We have the hotel receipt from the Palms Resort, charged to your corporate card as a team-building exercise. And we have this." She held up her phone. On the screen was a screenshot of Amber's Instagram story. His feet. Her feet. Paradise. Blake felt the blood drain from his face. "That's not what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like." Victor gestured to one of the large men. He stepped forward and handed Blake a thick manila envelope. "These are divorce papers filed in New York County Supreme Court. Grounds include adultery, abandonment, and emotional cruelty. You'll also find a temporary restraining order preventing you from accessing or transferring any marital assets, and an injunction barring you from the Tribeca residence. You are not to go home, Mr. Sutherland, and you are not to contact my client." Blake stared at the envelope like it contained a live grenade. "This is insane. Grace would never. She just had our baby. We need to talk about this. You forfeited your right to conversation when you boarded a plane to the Caribbean while your wife was in labor." Well, Victor's voice could have frozen the Hudson. "Now I suggest you find a hotel. You're going to need one." That's when Blake noticed them. At the edge of the tarmac, just beyond the restricted area, was a cluster of photographers. Long lenses pointed directly at him. He recognized one, a notorious paparazzo who sold to Page Six, and standing near them, arms crossed, watching with cold satisfaction, was Paige, Grace's sister. She raised her phone as if to toast him, then turned away. He had walked directly into a perfect ambush. "You can't do this," Blake whispered. The words sounded pathetic even to his own ears. "We already have." Victor turned back to her car. Her job done. "One more thing, Mr. Sutherland. Your company's board has been notified of the misuse of corporate funds for personal travel. I believe they'll want to discuss that with you. Soon." She slid into the back seat. The door closed with the finality of a coffin lid. Blake stood alone on the tarmac, holding a London snow globe and an envelope that would destroy his life. His phone began vibrating. The screen lit up with notifications, text messages, news alerts. His name was already spreading across gossip sites like a virus. Tech mogul Blake Sutherland served divorce papers after skipping son's birth. Meridian Capital CEO accused of affair, abandoning wife in labor. Blake Sutherland paradise lost. The headlines were brutal, efficient, designed for maximum viral spread. One of the large men who had arrived with Victor gestured to a waiting sedan. "Mr. Brennan has arranged for you to be taken to the Courtyard Marriott in Newark. Your credit cards have been frozen per the restraining order, but the room is prepaid for 3 nights. After that, you're on your own." Newark, the Courtyard Marriott. Blake Sutherland, who owned a $50 million penthouse in Tribeca, was being exiled to Newark. He got into the sedan because he had no other choice. As they pulled away from the private terminal, Blake opened the envelope with shaking hands. The legal language swam before his eyes, but certain phrases jumped out with brutal clarity. Irreconcilable differences, extreme emotional cruelty, willful abandonment of family duties. Attached were exhibits. Exhibit A, flight log to Turks and Caicos. Exhibit B, hotel receipt. Exhibit C, the Instagram screenshot, printed in high-definition color. His feet, her feet. The word paradise mocked him from the bottom of the page. Exhibit D was new, a sworn affidavit from Marcus, his driver of 4 years. It detailed every time Blake had him drop off Amber at the Tribeca penthouse when Grace was at her nonprofit board meetings. Every time Marcus had driven them to hotels in Connecticut, where they thought they wouldn't be recognized. Marcus had kept a log, dates, times, locations. Blake had tipped him generously at Christmas. Apparently not generously enough. His phone rang, the Meridian Capital board chair. Blake didn't answer. It rang again. His mother. He didn't answer. Again. Amber. Panicking. He threw the phone against the car window. "Sir, please don't damage the vehicle," the driver said calmly. Blake Sutherland, master of the universe, had flown home thinking he was the king returning to his castle. But the drawbridge was up, the locks were changed, and his kingdom was burning. 3 days after Connor's birth, Grace sat in Victor Brennan's corner office in Midtown, nursing her son while her life was dissected into legal strategy. The office was all glass and steel, with a view of Central Park that cost $1,000 per square foot. Victor's diplomas lined one wall: Harvard Law, Yale undergrad, clerkship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. "Your prenuptial agreement," Victor said, sliding a document across her desk, "was signed 5 years ago. Standard terms for these situations. In the event of divorce, you would receive $5 million, the Hamptons Beach House, and spousal support of $50,000 per month for 5 years. Generous by most standards, insulting given his net worth of approximately $400 million. Grace shifted Connor to her other breast. He latched immediately, his tiny hand curling around her finger. "But there's a clause," she said. It wasn't a question. Victor smiled. It was the smile of a chess player who had just seen checkmate 10 moves ahead. "There is indeed, but paragraph 7, subsection C, the fidelity clause. Your husband's attorneys included it as standard practice, never imagining it would actually apply. It states that in the event of proven adultery that results in public scandal and demonstrable harm to the family's reputation, the financial limitations of the prenup become null and void." "Meaning," Paige asked from her chair by the window, "meaning we can ask for anything. And more importantly, we can win." Victor leaned back in her leather chair. "Blake Sutherland made this easy for us. He didn't just have an affair. He had an affair with an employee, paid for it with corporate funds, and abandoned his wife during childbirth. Then his mistress posted photographic evidence to social media. The board is furious. The shareholders are furious. His reputation is already destroyed." Grace looked down at Connor, sleeping now against her chest. His face was peaceful, unaware that his father's destruction was being planned in a conference room overlooking Manhattan. "What do you recommend? Full custody with 0 visitation rights, $75 million settlement, the Tribeca penthouse, and a public apology." "He'll fight it," Grace said. "He'll lose." Victor's confidence was absolute. "I've already filed. The media coverage alone will make any judge sympathetic to you. New mother abandoned during labor by billionaire husband. You're the perfect victim. He's the perfect villain." Grace flinched at the word victim. She didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a woman who had been asleep for 5 years and had just woken up to find herself in a nightmare. "When do we go to court?" Paige asked. 2 weeks. Initial hearing for temporary orders. We'll get the restraining order extended, freeze his assets, and establish temporary custody. Then we negotiate. Blake's smart enough to know a trial would destroy what's left of his reputation. He'll settle. Victor was right. Blake settled. Not because he wanted to, but because his attorney, a shark named Richard Castellano who billed $800 per hour, explained in simple terms that going to trial would be suicide. The evidence was overwhelming. The optics were terrible. Blake Sutherland, the man who had built his fortune on disrupting traditional finance, was about to be disrupted by his own arrogance. The settlement took 6 weeks to finalize. Grace had got $75 million, full custody of Connor with supervised visitation for Blake only if he completed anger management and parenting classes and the Tribeca penthouse. Blake was allowed to keep his company, but he was forced to resign as CEO. The board installed an interim replacement. On a cold November afternoon, they signed the papers in a conference room at Victor's office. Blake looked like he had aged 10 years. His suit was wrinkled. His eyes were hollow. When he looked at Connor, sleeping in Grace's arms, something flickered across his face. Regret, anger. Grace couldn't tell and didn't care. "You happy now?" Blake asked as he signed the final page. Happy? Grace looked at him, really looked at him. The man she had loved, or thought she had loved. "I'm not happy. Blake, I'm free. There's a difference." She walked out of that conference room with her son and her sister, $75 million richer and completely unburdened by the weight of a marriage built on lies. That night, back in the penthouse that was now solely hers, Grace opened a bottle of wine. Paige raised her glass. "To victory," Paige said. Grace touched her glass to her sister's, but didn't drink. Something felt wrong. The victory was too clean, too easy. Blake had signed too quickly at the end. He had looked at her with something in his eyes that she couldn't quite read. "What's wrong?" Paige asked. "I don't know," Grace said honestly. "It just feels like we're missing something." She was right. 6 months passed. Grace rebuilt her life piece by piece. She hired a nanny, a warm Jamaican woman named Patricia, who treated Connor like her own grandson. She went back to therapy to process the trauma of Blake's abandonment. She started making plans for a new nonprofit. This one focused on helping women who had been gaslit by powerful men. Connor was thriving. At 6 months, he was hitting every milestone. He smiled at Grace like she hung the moon. He had her eyes in her nose. Thank God. Very little of Blake in him, at least physically. Blake had disappeared from their lives completely. He hadn't attempted to see Connor, hadn't completed the court-ordered parenting classes. According to Paige's sources, he had moved to a high-rise in Battery Park and was trying to rebuild Meridian Capital's reputation. Amber Fitzgerald had been fired and had vanished from New York entirely. Rumor was she was in Los Angeles, trying to rebrand as a lifestyle influencer. Grace should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt watched, followed, like a storm was building just beyond the horizon. The storm broke on a Tuesday morning in April. Victor called at 7 a.m. "We have a problem." Grace's blood went cold. Connor was asleep in his crib. Patricia hadn't arrived yet. "What kind of problem?" "Blake has filed a motion to vacate the divorce settlement. He's claiming fraud." "What? That's insane." "What fraud?" Victor's voice was tight. "He's alleging that you manipulated evidence, that you coerced him into signing under duress, and that his brother Derek is willing to testify that you orchestrated the entire scenario." Derek, Blake's older brother, who had been at Connor's birth, who had hugged Grace and told her she was doing great. Derek, who she thought was on her side. "Derek wouldn't do that," Grace said. But even as she said it, she knew she was wrong. Derek was Blake's brother. Blood was thicker than settlement agreements. "There's more," Victor said. "Blake has hired Catherine Walsh." Catherine Walsh. The name alone made Grace's stomach drop. Walsh was a crisis management specialist, a fixer who had rehabilitated the images of politicians caught with prostitutes and CEOs accused of embezzlement. She didn't change the facts. She changed the narrative. "What does this mean for us?" Grace asked. "It means we're going back to court. And this time, Blake is playing for keeps." The motion hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In that time, Catherine Walsh worked her dark magic. Suddenly, Blake Sutherland wasn't a villain. He was a victim, a man who had made mistakes. Yes, but who had been entrapped by a vindictive wife who had used her pregnancy as a weapon. The narrative Walsh crafted was brilliant in its simplicity. Grace had known about Amber for months. She had deliberately tracked Blake's movements, waited for him to leave on a business trip, then gone into premature labor. She had orchestrated the airport ambush, the media coverage, everything. She was the manipulator. Blake was just a flawed man who had fallen into her trap. It was a complete fabrication. It was also devastatingly effective. The New York Post ran a feature, "Did Grace Holloway set up her billionaire husband?" Online comment sections filled with speculation. Maybe she was the real villain. Maybe Blake deserved a second chance. The hearing was held in a wood-paneled courtroom in Manhattan. Judge Patricia Morrison presided. A woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and zero patience for theatrics. Blake's new attorney, a woman named Jennifer Strauss who specialized in family law, stood before the bench. "Your Honor, my client was coerced into signing a settlement he did not understand while under extreme emotional duress. He had just learned of his son's birth, had been ambushed at an airport, and was being tried in the court of public opinion before he even had a chance to defend himself." Victor stood. "Your Honor, Mr. Sutherland abandoned his wife during childbirth to vacation with his mistress. The evidence is overwhelming and undisputed. This is a transparent attempt to relitigate a settlement he freely entered into. Your Honor," Strauss continued, "we have new evidence that calls into question the timeline of events. We've submitted an affidavit from Derek Sutherland, Mr. Sutherland's brother, who states that Mrs. Holloway confessed to him at the hospital that she had been planning this for months." Grace's head whipped toward the defense table. Blake sat there, looking contrite and wounded. Next to him was Derek, who refused to meet her eyes. Judge Morrison reviewed the affidavit. "This is a serious allegation. Miss Brennan, how does your client respond?" Victor stood. "Your Honor, Derek Sutherland has a clear financial interest in supporting his brother's claims. Blake Sutherland owes Derek approximately $2 million from a failed real estate investment. This testimony is bought and paid for." "That's a serious accusation," Judge Morrison said. "It's also true. We've submitted bank records showing the loan and evidence that Blake promised to forgive the debt if Derek testified on his behalf." Judge Morrison read through the documents. Her expression darkened. "Mr. Sutherland, did you offer to forgive your brother's debt in exchange for his testimony?" Blake's attorney whispered urgently in his ear. Finally, he stood. "Your Honor, I simply wanted my brother to tell the truth about what he witnessed." "That's not what I asked you." "Mr. Sutherland." A long pause, then, quietly, "Yes, Your Honor, I told him I would forgive the loan." Judge Morrison removed her glasses. "That, Mr. Sutherland, is witness tampering. Bailiff, please take Mr. Derek Sutherland into custody pending investigation for perjury." The courtroom erupted. Derek was led out in handcuffs, his face white with shock. Blake's carefully constructed case collapsed in real time, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. "However, Ms. Brennan, I am troubled by some elements of the original settlement. $75 million is an extraordinary amount, particularly given that the marriage lasted only 5 years. I'm going to order a full financial disclosure from both parties and schedule a new hearing in 60 days. Until then, the current custody arrangement stands, but all financial terms of the settlement are frozen pending review." Grace felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Frozen, her accounts, her security, everything was suddenly in limbo. As they filed out of the courthouse, Victor pulled Grace aside. "This isn't over. Morrison is conservative on financial awards. She might reduce the settlement significantly." "How significantly?" "Worst case back to the prenup terms. $5 million instead of 75. Grace looked at Connor, sleeping peacefully in his stroller, unaware that his future had just been thrown into chaos. She had thought it was over. She had thought she was safe. She had been wrong. The next 60 days were purgatory. Grace's accounts were frozen except for a monthly allowance of $15,000, barely enough to cover Patricia's salary and basic expenses in Manhattan. She couldn't access the settlement money. She couldn't sell assets. She was trapped in limbo while Blake's attorneys filed motion after motion, each one designed to wear her down. Catherine Walsh continued her media campaign. Blake gave a carefully staged interview to a sympathetic journalist from the Times. He looked older, humbler. He spoke about his mistakes with what seemed like genuine remorse. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Blake said, his voice cracking at precisely the right moment. "I'm just asking for a chance to be a father to my son, to be part of his life." Grace has every right to be angry, But Connor deserves to have both parents. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Blake never directly attacked Grace. He simply painted himself as a repentant sinner seeking redemption. The public ate it up. Disgraced tech mogul seeks second chance at fatherhood. Blake Sutherland, a man reformed. Online opinion shifted. Maybe he did deserve another chance. Maybe Grace was being too harsh. After all, people made mistakes. Wasn't forgiveness important? The financial disclosure hearing revealed something Grace hadn't known. Blake had hidden assets, shell companies in Delaware, offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, properties in other people's names. Victor had suspected as much, but proving it was another matter. Blake's attorneys argued that most of these assets predated the marriage and were therefore not subject to division. They also argued that the original settlement had been based on inflated valuations of Meridian Capital, which had lost significant value after Blake's resignation. Judge Morrison listened to both sides. Then she delivered her ruling. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, I find that the original settlement was excessive given the length of the marriage and the circumstances. I am reducing the financial award from $75 million to $15 million to be paid over 5 years. Mrs. Holloway will retain the Tribeca penthouse and full physical custody of the minor child. Mr. Sutherland will have supervised visitation rights, pending completion of parenting classes. $15 million, down from $75. Grace did the math in her head. After taxes and Victor's fees, she would net maybe $8 million, enough to be comfortable. Not enough to be secure against someone like Blake, who could spend millions on attorneys without blinking. But it got worse. 2 weeks after the ruling, Blake filed for joint custody. His attorneys argued that he had completed the court-ordered parenting classes, that he had maintained stable employment, and that Connor deserved a relationship with his father. The custody evaluation was brutal. A court-appointed psychologist interviewed both Grace and Blake, observed them with Connor, and reviewed thousands of pages of documents. The psychologist's report was mixed. Grace was clearly the primary caregiver and had been present for all of Connor's developmental milestones. But Blake appeared genuinely interested in forming a relationship with his son. There was no evidence of abuse or neglect. The recommendation joint legal custody with primary physical custody to Grace and unsupervised visitation for Blake, starting with day visits and gradually building to overnight visits. Grace read the report in Victor's office, Connor playing with blocks on the floor. "He abandoned us," she said, her voice hollow. "He left me alone during labor. He lied for months, and now he gets to be Father of the Year. The system doesn't care about betrayal," Victor said gently. "It cares about what's best for the child, and the law presumes that 2 parents are better than one, even when one of those parents is Blake Sutherland." Victor didn't answer. She didn't need to. The first visitation was supervised at a family center in Brooklyn. Blake arrived with gifts, expensive toys, designer baby clothes. Connor, now 9 months old and crawling, was wary of this stranger. He cried when Blake tried to pick him up, reaching for Grace. Blake's face darkened. "He doesn't even know me. You've been alienating him from me." "He doesn't know you because you've never been in his life," Grace shot back. The supervisor intervened. "Let's keep this focused on Connor, please." Grace watched as Blake clumsily tried to engage with his son. He didn't know how to hold him properly. He didn't know that Connor was allergic to strawberries or that he only napped if you rubbed his back in small circles. He didn't know anything, but he was learning. And every visit, Connor warmed to him a little more. By the 3rd visit, Connor let Blake pick him up without crying. By the 5th, he smiled at his father. Grace felt something breaking inside her. She had lost the first battle. She was losing this one too. One night, alone in the penthouse after putting Connor to bed, Grace stood at the window overlooking the Hudson. The city lights blurred through her tears. She had done everything right. She had gathered evidence. She had hired the best attorney. She had told the truth. And she was still losing. Her phone buzzed. A news alert. Blake had been photographed leaving a restaurant in Soho with a woman. Young, beautiful, blonde. Not Amber. Someone new. The caption read, "Blake Sutherland, back on the dating scene." Grace stared at the photo. Blake was smiling, his arm around the woman's waist. He looked happy, unburdened. Meanwhile, Grace was trapped in an endless legal battle, watching her son bond with a man who had abandoned them both. She thought about giving up, about calling Victor and saying she'd accept whatever Blake offered, just to make it stop, about taking Connor and leaving New York entirely, starting over somewhere Blake couldn't find them. But she knew that was impossible. The court had ruled. Blake had rights now. If she ran, she'd be violating a court order. She'd lose Connor forever. She was trapped, and Blake knew it. Her phone rang. Paige. Did you see the photo? I saw it. Grace, I'm worried about you. You sound defeated. I am defeated. Paige, what's the point? He wins. He always wins. The system is designed to protect men like him. That's not true, but isn't it? Grace's voice was bitter. He abandoned me during labor. He had an affair. He embezzled from his own company. And what happened? He got a slap on the wrist, a reduced settlement, and custody rights. Meanwhile, I'm the villain for keeping his son away from him. Silence on the other end. Then Paige said, I have something to tell you, but you can't tell Victor. Not yet. What? I've been doing some digging into Amber Fitzgerald. She didn't just disappear to LA. She's been talking. To me. Grace's heart started pounding. What do you mean? She reached out 2 weeks ago, said she has information about Blake, about the affair, things that weren't in the original evidence. Like what? Like the fact that Blake planned the entire Turks and Caicos trip specifically to avoid Connor's birth. That he told Amber your pregnancy was a mistake that was ruining his life. That he wanted you to have an abortion and you refused. Grace felt ice flood her veins. She had never told anyone about that conversation. The one that happened 3 months into her pregnancy, when Blake had suggested, gently, that maybe now wasn't the right time for a baby. That maybe they should wait. That maybe they should reconsider. She had thought he was just scared. Now she understood. He had never wanted Connor at all. Can she prove any of this? Grace asked. She recorded him on her phone. Hours of conversations. She kept them as insurance in case Blake ever turned on her, which he did, when he fired her and hung her out to dry. Why is she coming forward now? Because she's broke. Blake left her with nothing. And because, believe it or not, she feels guilty. She was there, Grace. She heard him say terrible things about you and Connor, and she went along with it because she thought he loved her. She knows now that he used her just like he used you. Grace's mind raced. We need to get those recordings to Victor. That's the thing. Amber wants money. She's selling the recordings to the highest bidder. If we don't buy them, Blake's team will, or she'll sell them to the tabloids. How much does she want? $500,000? Grace laughed, a hollow sound. I have $15,000 in my account right now. Everything else is frozen or tied up in legal fees. I know. But Grace, if we don't get those recordings, Blake will, and he'll destroy them. This is our only chance. Grace looked at Connor's nursery door. Inside, her son was sleeping peacefully, unaware that his father had never wanted him to exist. Find a way to get the money, Grace said. I don't care how. Borrow it, mortgage something, but get those recordings. Already on it, Paige said. I have a friend who owes me a favor. We'll have the money by tomorrow. Grace hung up and returned to the window. The city looked different now. Not like a prison, but like a battlefield. And she was still in the fight. Blake thought he had won. He had no idea what was coming. Amber Fitzgerald met them in a Starbucks in Midtown, wearing oversized sunglasses and a baseball cap like she was in a spy movie. She looked nothing like the confident woman from the Instagram posts. She looked scared. Paige slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a cashier's check for $500,000, borrowed against Paige's own retirement fund. It would take her years to pay it back. She did it anyway. Amber didn't open the envelope. She just slid a USB drive across the table in exchange. There are 23 recordings. Dates and timestamps are all there. I've made copies. If anything happens to me, they go public. Understand? We're not Blake, Paige said coldly. We don't hurt people. Amber flinched. I know what you think of me. You think I'm a homewrecker, a gold digger. Maybe I was, but I didn't know she was pregnant when it started. By the time I found out, I was already in love with him, or I thought I was. She looked at Grace for the first time. I'm sorry, that doesn't mean anything. I know, but I am. Grace studied her. Amber was 27, the same age Grace had been when she married Blake. Young enough to believe a powerful man when he said his wife didn't understand him. Young enough to think she was special. The exception, the one he would change for. Did you love him? Grace asked. I thought I did, but he didn't love me. He didn't love you either. Blake Sutherland only loves Blake Sutherland. Amber stood up. Those recordings will destroy him, but they'll also destroy me. Everyone will know I was recording him without his consent. I'll never work in New York again. I'm leaving, moving back to Nebraska, starting over. She walked out, leaving Grace and Paige alone with the USB drive. Back at Victor's office, they plugged it into a computer. Victor's paralegal pulled up the audio files. 23 conversations, spanning 6 months. They started listening. The first recording was from January, 7 months before Connor's birth. Blake and Amber in what sounded like a hotel room. Blake's voice, she's not going to get an abortion. I already tried. She's dug in. Amber's voice, what are you going to do, Blake? What can I do? I'm trapped. I thought marrying her would be good for my image. You know, the successful guy with the beautiful wife who does charity work. But a baby, that wasn't part of the plan. Now I'm stuck playing dad for the next 18 years to Amber. Do you love her, Blake? I love what she represents. I don't love her. How can you love someone who's that easy to manipulate? Grace felt like she'd been punched. Victor paused the recording. Do you need a break? No. Keep going. The second recording was worse. It was from March, 6 months before Connor's birth. Blake's voice. I've been thinking. What if Emma's just not there when she goes into labor tomorrow? I'll be out of town. Business trip. By the time I get back, it's over. She handles it on her own. Then I don't have time to deal with the whole birth thing. That's her department. Amber's voice. Won't that look bad? Blake? Only if anyone finds out it wasn't really a business trip. That's why we're going to the Caribbean. No one will know. Amber, what if she needs you, Blake? She has her sister. She'll be fine. Women have babies alone all the time. It's not like she's special. Grace's hands were shaking. Victor stopped the recording. Grace, this is exactly what we need. This proves premeditation. This proves he deliberately abandoned you. A judge will eviscerate him with this evidence. They listened to all 23 recordings over the next 3 hours. Each one was worse than the last. Blake called Grace boring, clingy, a burden. He told Amber he was planning to divorce Grace after the baby was born, that he'd wait a year to avoid looking bad, then he'd paint her as an unfit mother and take custody. He said Connor was his backup plan for when Meridian Capital eventually went public, that having a son made him look stable, family-oriented, good for the IPO. The final recording was from October 14th, the day before Connor's birth. Blake and Amber were at the airport, boarding the flight to Turks and Caicos. Blake's voice. I'm turning off my phone, Egon. If Grace goes into labor, I don't want to know. I'll deal with it when I get back. Amber's voice. Are you sure, Blake? I'm sure. This is my last weekend of freedom before I'm a dad. I'm going to enjoy it. The recording ended. The office was silent. Victor spoke first. With this evidence, we can file a motion to terminate Blake's parental rights entirely. This isn't just abandonment. This is malicious, premeditated rejection of his child. No judge will give him custody now. Do it, Grace said. Her voice was steady. File the motion. Use every recording. I want Blake to lose everything. Victor filed the emergency motion the next day. Blake's attorneys tried to quash it, arguing that the recordings were obtained illegally. But New York was a one-party consent state. Amber had been part of the conversations. The recordings were admissible. The hearing was scheduled for 1 week later. Catherine Walsh went into overdrive, trying to control the damage. But she couldn't. The recordings leaked. Someone in the court clerk's office, someone who was as disgusted by Blake as everyone else, sent the files to the media. By the next morning, the recordings were everywhere. Every news outlet, every gossip blog, every social media platform. Blake's voice, cold and calculating, talking about his pregnant wife like she was an inconvenience, talking about his son like he was a prop. The public turned on him immediately. The redemption arc Catherine Walsh had carefully constructed collapsed. Blake wasn't a flawed man seeking forgiveness. He was a monster. Meridian Capital's board called another emergency meeting. This time, they didn't just ask Blake to resign. They fired him. They terminated his contract, voided his stock options, and announced they were cooperating with federal investigators looking into his misuse of corporate funds. Grace watched the news coverage from her penthouse. Connor playing at her feet. Blake's face was on every channel, replaying his worst moments, his most callous statements. She should have felt victorious. She should have felt vindicated. Instead, she felt empty. The hearing was almost anticlimactic. Blake's attorney barely mounted a defense. What could she say? The recordings spoke for themselves. Judge Morrison looked at Blake with undisguised contempt. Mr. Sutherland, I have presided over family court for 20 years. I have seen terrible things, but I have rarely seen such calculated cruelty toward one's own child. You deliberately planned to miss your son's birth. You referred to him as a burden, a trap, a prop for your public image. You have demonstrated no capacity for parental love or responsibility. She looked down at her notes. I am terminating your parental rights effective immediately. You will have no contact with Connor Holloway. You will have no say in his upbringing. You are not his father. You are a sperm donor. Nothing more. Blake stood, his face red. Your Honor, Sit down, Mr. Sutherland. I'm not finished. I am also referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential criminal conduct, including but not limited to witness tampering, perjury, and fraud. You are dismissed. Blake was led out of the courtroom. He looked broken, destroyed. Grace watched him go and felt nothing. But she should have known. Blake Sutherland didn't break. He adapted. 3 months passed. Grace's life stabilized. The full $75 million settlement was reinstated. Blake's assets were seized to pay it. She sold the Tribeca penthouse and bought a brownstone in Brooklyn, something smaller, warmer, more like a home than a museum. Connor was thriving. At 15 months, he was walking, talking, and laughing. He called Patricia Patty and loved to play in Prospect Park. He had no memory of Blake, no father-shaped hole in his life. He was happy. Grace started her nonprofit, the Holloway Foundation, dedicated to providing legal aid to women gaslit by powerful men. Victor Brennan sat on the board. Paige ran day-to-day operations. In 3 months, they had helped over 200 women escape abusive situations. Blake had disappeared from public life. According to news reports, he had moved to Miami, was trying to start a new venture capital firm. Catherine Walsh had dropped him as a client. Amber was back in Nebraska, living with her parents, working at her father's hardware store. Grace should have felt safe. She should have felt finished with Blake. But late at night, when Connor was asleep and the brownstone was quiet, she sometimes felt watched, followed, like Blake was still out there, plotting something. She was right. The lawsuit hit like a meteor. Blake's new attorney, a shark from Miami named Gerald Roth, filed a $100 million defamation suit against Grace, Paige, Victor, and Amber. The complaint alleged that the recordings had been doctored, that Blake had been entrapped, and that the entire campaign to destroy his reputation had been a conspiracy. It was absurd. It would never succeed. But that wasn't the point, The point was to bleed Grace dry, to force her to spend millions on attorneys, to tie her up in litigation for years, to make her life miserable, and it worked. Victor's firm billed $300,000 in the first month just responding to the initial complaint. Other law firms refused to take the case on contingency. They all knew Blake would lose, but they also knew it would take years and millions of dollars to reach that conclusion. Grace called an emergency meeting with Victor and Paige. How do we end this? We can't, Victor said bluntly. Not quickly. Roth is using every delay tactic in the book. This will take 3 years minimum to resolve. I'll be bankrupt by then. Probably not, but you'll spend $10 million in legal fees before it's done. Paige slammed her hand on the table. There has to be something, some leverage we're missing. Grace thought about it. What did Blake want? Not Connor. He'd never wanted Connor. Not vindication. He knew he was guilty. What Blake wanted was to hurt her, to make her suffer the way he was suffering. Then it hit her. Derek, she said. Blake's brother. He committed perjury for Blake. He was arrested but never prosecuted because he agreed to testify truthfully. What if we offered him a deal? Victor's eyes narrowed. What kind of deal? Blake must have told Derek things. Confidences? What if Derek has evidence of other crimes? Tax evasion, securities fraud, things that could send Blake to prison. Victor smiled slowly. You want to threaten Blake with criminal prosecution. I want to end this. If Blake knows he's facing prison time, he'll drop the lawsuit. It took 2 weeks to arrange the meeting. Derek agreed to talk, but only with immunity from prosecution for anything he revealed. The U.S. Attorney's Office agreed. Desperate for a high-profile conviction, Derek met them in a conference room at the Federal Building in Lower Manhattan. He looked terrible. Thin, pale, haunted. Blake ruined my life, Derek said without preamble. He got me to lie for him, promised to pay off my debts. Then he hung me out to dry. I lost my job. My wife left me. I'm living in a studio in Queens, working as a paralegal. I have nothing left to lose. What can you tell us? Victor asked. Derek opened a folder. Inside were bank statements, emails, contracts. Blake has been hiding assets in offshore accounts for years. Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Singapore. He's evaded probably $50 million in taxes. He also used Meridian Capital funds for personal expenses, not just the Turks and Caicos trip, hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions. I helped him set it up. I know where every account is, every shell company, every fake invoice. Victor reviewed the documents. Her face was grim. This is enough to prosecute, easily. There's more, Derek said. Blake approached me last month. He wants me to testify in his defamation case. He offered me $5 million to say Grace threatened me, forced me to lie. Grace's blood ran cold. What did you say? I said yes. Then I contacted the U.S. attorney and told them everything. Derek looked at Grace. I'm sorry for what I did. I was desperate. Blake has a way of making you think you have no choice, but you always have a choice. I'm making mine now. 2 days later, FBI agents raided Blake's Miami office. They seized computers, files, bank records. Blake was arrested and held without bail pending trial for tax evasion, securities fraud, wire fraud, and witness tampering. His attorney, Gerald Roth, called Victor within hours. My client is willing to dismiss all pending litigation in exchange for your client agreeing not to cooperate with federal prosecutors. Tell your client to go to hell, Victor said pleasantly. We're cooperating fully, and we're countersuing for malicious prosecution. Mr. Sutherland can rot in prison. Blake's trial lasted 6 weeks. Derek testified for 3 days, methodically laying out every crime Blake had committed. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Blake Sutherland was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. No parole for at least 5 years. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his face blank, defeated. Grace watched from the gallery, Connor asleep in her arms. She felt nothing. No vindication, no joy. Just an overwhelming sense of relief that it was finally over. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Grace gave a brief statement. Today, the justice system worked. Blake Sutherland is facing consequences for his actions. I hope this sends a message to other powerful men who think they're above the law. You're not, and eventually, you will answer for what you've done. She went home to her brownstone, to Patricia and Paige and Connor. That night, they ordered takeout and watched Connor play with his blocks. He was building a tower, laughing every time it fell down and building it again. Grace's phone buzzed. A news alert. Blake Sutherland sentenced to 7 years. From billionaire to inmate. She dismissed the notification without reading it. Blake was the past. Connor was the future. Dark. Mama, Connor said, holding up a block. Tower. That's right, baby, Grace said, pulling him into her lap. You're building something strong. She kissed the top of his head and thought about the woman she had been 2 years ago, sitting in the Tribeca penthouse, feeling trapped and powerless. That woman was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had survived betrayal, fought the system, and won. The price of paradise, Grace thought, had been her old life. The reward was this new one, Connor in her arms, a brownstone in Brooklyn, a foundation helping hundreds of women, a sister who had fought beside her. Freedom. Blake had wanted paradise. He had gotten prison. Grace had wanted justice. She had gotten so much more. 4 years after Connor's birth, Grace stood in the conference room of the Holloway Foundation's new offices in downtown Brooklyn. Through the windows, she could see the Manhattan skyline, but it felt distant now, like a photograph of somewhere she used to live. The foundation had grown beyond her wildest expectations. They had helped over 3,000 women escape abusive relationships. They had lobbied for changes to New York's prenuptial agreement laws. They had funded research into financial abuse and coercive control. Grace was featured in Forbes, not as someone's wife, but as a philanthropist and advocate in her own right. Connor was 4 years old now, bright and funny, and completely unaware of his father's existence. He went to a Montessori preschool in Park Slope. He had friends. He loved dinosaurs and trains and his Aunt Paige, who spoiled him ruthlessly. When people asked about his father, Grace had a simple answer: he's not in our lives. Blake had been in prison for 3.5 years. According to the occasional news update, he was a model prisoner. He had taught financial literacy classes to other inmates. He had become a vegan. He had found God, or at least claimed to. Catherine Walsh had written a book about his case, painting him as a tragic figure brought down by his own hubris. It had sold poorly. Grace had moved on. She was dating someone, a civil rights attorney named Marcus, who made her laugh and respected her boundaries. It wasn't serious yet, but it was nice, normal, the kind of relationship she should have had all along. Then the letter arrived. It came from the New York State Department of Corrections. Blake Sutherland was eligible for parole in 6 months. As Connor's biological father, he was requesting a restorative justice meeting to discuss co-parenting arrangements upon his release. Grace read the letter 3 times, each time feeling a fresh wave of rage. Blake had no parental rights. Judge Morrison had terminated them. This was a stunt. She called Victor, who was now a close friend. Can he do this? So technically, he can request anything, but judges rarely restore parental rights after termination, especially in cases like this. This is probably just Blake trying to generate sympathy for his parole hearing. He wants to show he's reformed, that he wants to be a father. He's never wanted to be a father. He wants to hurt me. I know, but he can't. You're protected. Connor is protected. Blake lost Grace completely and permanently. But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that Blake had one last move to make. The parole hearing was scheduled for November 15th. Grace was invited to submit a victim impact statement. She spent weeks writing it, revising it, trying to capture everything Blake had taken from her: the trust, the years, the innocence of believing her husband loved her. In the end, she kept it simple. Blake Sutherland is a man who planned to miss his son's birth so he could vacation with his mistress. He is a man who called his child a burden and a trap. He is a man who lied, cheated, and defrauded everyone around him. He belongs in prison. If you release him, he will hurt someone else. This is not rehabilitation. This is manipulation. I urge you to deny his parole. The hearing was closed to the public, but Victor attended as Grace's representative. She waited at home, Connor playing at her feet, for the decision. Victor called at 3 p.m. Parole denied. The board found insufficient evidence of rehabilitation. Blake is remanded for his full sentence. He'll serve another 3.5 years. Grace felt the tension drain from her shoulders. Thank God. There's something else. Blake had a statement read at the hearing. A letter. He asked that it be forwarded to you. I don't want to read anything from Blake, and you should read this one. The letter arrived by courier that evening. Grace put Connor to bed, poured herself a glass of wine, and opened it. The handwriting was Blake's, still confident despite everything. Grace, I won't insult you by asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I destroyed our marriage, abandoned our son, and tried to destroy you when you fought back. I'm guilty of everything you accuse me of and more. Prison has given me time to think. Too much time. I understand now what I did. Not just the affair, but the years of manipulation. The way I made you doubt yourself. The way I made you small so I could feel big. That was the real crime. Connor is 4 now. I've seen photos. Paige posts them sometimes. I don't think she knows I can see them. He looks happy. He looks loved. That's because of you. I'm not asking to see him. I'm not asking for anything. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. Not the performative sorry I said in court, trying to save myself. I'm truly sorry for the pain I caused. You won, completely. You rebuilt your life into something better than it was. You're helping people I hurt. You're raising our son to be nothing like me. That's the greatest revenge you could have taken. I'll be in prison for another 3.5 years. When I get out, I'll leave New York. You'll never hear from me again. That's my gift to you. Freedom from me. Take care of our son. Tell him, when he's old enough to understand, that his father was a coward who didn't deserve him. Blake, Grace read the letter twice. Then she walked to the fireplace and burned it. She watched Blake's word curl and blacken and turn to ash. Some people didn't deserve closure. Some people didn't deserve forgiveness. Blake Sutherland was both. 3 years later, Grace stood at the edge of a park in Brooklyn, watching Connor play soccer with his team. He was 7 years old now, all legs and enthusiasm, completely unaware that today marked exactly 7 years since the day he was born, the day everything changed. Marcus stood beside her, his hand in hers. They had been married for 6 months, a small ceremony in the brownstone garden with just family and close friends. Connor had been the ring bearer, taking his job with adorable seriousness. Marcus was a good stepfather, patient and kind. He didn't try to replace Blake because there was nothing to replace. He just loved Connor for who Connor was. Grace's phone buzzed. A news alert. Blake Sutherland released from prison after serving full 7-year sentence. She dismissed the notification without reading further. Blake had kept his word. He had left New York immediately upon release, moved to somewhere in Montana according to Paige's sources. He was working construction, living in a studio apartment, completely removed from his former life. The billionaire had become ordinary. Grace didn't care. Blake was a ghost, a cautionary tale she sometimes told at foundation events when asked about her journey. She never used his name. He was just my ex-husband, a figure in a story that belonged to someone else. The Holloway Foundation had opened branches in 5 states. They had helped over 10,000 women. Congress had passed legislation, the Financial Coercion Prevention Act, based on their advocacy work. Grace testified before Senate committees. She spoke at universities. She had become exactly what Blake had feared, more powerful without him than she ever was with him. Connor scored a goal. He turned to the sideline, looking for Grace, his face bright with joy. She cheered, Marcus beside her, and Connor waved before running back into the game. That night, after Connor was asleep and Marcus was in his study working, Grace poured herself a glass of wine and sat on the back patio of the brownstone. The garden was full of late summer blooms, roses and lavender and jasmine. Patricia had helped her plant everything. The old nanny was retired now, but still came by weekly to see her baby. Paige joined her, carrying her own glass. You okay? I saw the news about Blake. I'm fine. I don't think about him anymore. Not really. Liar. You're thinking about him right now. Grace smiled. Paige knew her too well. I was thinking about paradise, about what it means. Blake thought paradise was an infinity pool in Turks and Caicos. He thought it was money and power and getting whatever he wanted. What do you think it is? Grace looked back at the house. Inside, Connor was sleeping in his dinosaur pajamas, clutching the stuffed triceratops Marcus had given him. Marcus was in his study, working on a civil rights case he was passionate about. Patricia would stop by tomorrow for Sunday brunch. The foundation was helping someone right now, at this very moment, somewhere in America. A woman was escaping. A child was being protected. This, Grace said simply, this is paradise. Not because it's perfect, because it's real, because it's mine, because I built it from nothing after Blake burned everything down. Paige raised her glass. To paradise found. Grace touched her glass to her sisters. To paradise earned. They drank in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky. Somewhere in Montana, Blake Sutherland was learning what it meant to be ordinary. Somewhere in Brooklyn, Grace Holloway was living proof that you could lose everything and still win. The price of paradise had been her innocence, her trust, 5 years of her life. The reward was this moment, this peace, this hard-won knowledge that she was strong enough to survive anything. Connor called out in his sleep, a small sound. Grace went inside to check on him, Marcus following close behind. Connor was still asleep, just dreaming. She pulled his blanket up, kissed his forehead. "Love you, buddy," she whispered. "Love you, Mama," he murmured without waking. Grace stood there for a moment, watching her son breathe. Blake had called him a burden, a trap, a prop for his public image. Blake had been wrong about so many things, but he had been most wrong about this. Connor wasn't a burden. He was a gift, the greatest gift. And Grace had been given the privilege of raising him alone, without Blake's toxicity, without his manipulation. She closed Connor's door gently and went back downstairs, where Marcus was making popcorn and Paige was queuing up a movie. This was her family now. This was her life. The woman who had sat in the Tribeca penthouse 7 years ago, feeling trapped and small and powerless, would barely recognize her now. That woman had been convinced she needed Blake to survive. She had been wrong. Grace Holloway didn't need anyone to complete her. She was already complete. Everything else was just a bonus. Outside, the Brooklyn night was alive with sound, traffic, voices, music from a neighbor's window. The city that had witnessed her fall was now witnessing her rise. And Grace, curled up on her couch between her sister and her husband, watching Connor's favorite movie for the 100th time, understood something Blake never would. Paradise wasn't a place you flew to on a private jet. It wasn't an infinity pool or a penthouse view. Paradise was what you built after everything burned down. It was the life you created from the ashes of the life someone else destroyed. Blake had wanted paradise. He had chosen the illusion. Grace had lost paradise. She had found something better. She had found herself, and in the end, that was the only victory that mattered.